definition added for Strathclyde. I call upon Tala to replace the science in their name. Here, here.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the point, we think it's nice to have people from other groups and stuff like that in society. We're not trying to do some kind of weird BNP thing where we only want white English people or whatever to be in the UK, just to get that straight in case opposition tries to decide we're doing that. We think it's a lovely thing to have people from other cultures. However, where we draw the line is that at the point that it makes it difficult for the government of our state to govern, and it makes the lives of the people in that state more difficult, or it creates more discontent. That's where we draw the line when we say that we don't want to give citizenship to these people. That's where we think that we're legitimate and say no to them, right? So let's just get a couple of small definitions out of the way before I get onto my case, right? So, for example, what do we mean by predominant values, okay? So what we think we're talking about is things like democracy, like equality for minorities, like major values that underpin the state. We're not asking these people to agree with every single tiny thing that the West has ever done. We're talking about the overall arching linchpin sort of principle of the state.
No, clarification. Yeah, in America, for example, you have a lot of people who are very opposed to gay people. So claiming this is a predominant value in itself isn't something as a discourse.
Okay. First of all, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a principle. Even people who are morally against gay people, I'm sure would still accept that, the fact that there are people who are for it and don't mind living in a state where they have equal rights, even if they don't on a personal basis agree with it. So we think that doesn't really count. Okay. So secondly, we don't think that this is a belief debate or whatever, but we're not going to interrogate everybody and shine a light in their eyes and punch them and slap them around the face or whatever. We're just talking about people who either have a history of we know that they disbelieve in these values, either if they've been involved in protests or something like that, or if they're just open about it. We've got eyewitness accounts or whatever. We know that they're open about it, so that's what we're talking about. So let's get on to my case, right? So I'm first going to talk to you about who these people are and why it makes it difficult for them to integrate into society if they contradict the values and the harms of that. And then I'm going to talk about this idea of backlash and how it makes it difficult for the government of that state and the people within that state. So let's get on to this idea of who they are, right? Okay, we think that by the very definition that they are open about these values. It's not the fact that they have these opinions that we necessarily object to. We think everyone is entitled to an opinion, that's fine. But the point is at which it becomes an open opinion, and it becomes an opinion which is potentially spread within society, we say that that's a potential harm, and that's what we want to protect from, right? So we think that with the people who have inherent contradictory opinions to on our principles, right? We think that they're not going to be in a position to want to settle down and make a life for themselves in our country, right? Yeah. Why do we think that? Why is this important? Well, we think that, as I said before, we think that the state should grant residence and stuff like that to people when their motive is good, when they're coming over because they either come from a bad background, they see this as an idea of a better life, they see it as a better opportunity for them, and because they actually do like our principles, and because they want to contribute to the state and make a better life. Right? No, thank you. However, we think that these kinds of people, they're not going to contribute to the state, and because we think they're going to do everything to make it hard for that state, right? Because if you disagree with the state's fundamental principles, if you don't agree with the state being democratic, if you don't agree with the state being equal or anything like that, why would you want to contribute meaningfully to it? It just doesn't make any sense. We don't think these people are going to say, I fundamentally disagree with the principle and structure of the state. However, I'm going to get a job to pay my taxes. We just don't think that that's a thing. So we think that why is this important? Well, we think that the state government should be responsible first to its own citizens, and we think and then after that, right? We think that it's fine for them to let in people as long as it doesn't do harm to their own citizens and their ability to govern. And we think that we extend that right to others when they say that they want to be a part of our state, when they want to contribute to that state too. We think that it happens when the state says, I'm responsible for my own citizens, and then someone else comes in and says, do you know what, I'm willing to contribute, I want you to be responsible for me too. We think, no. We think that's how it works. We think that what that means is that the state then becomes responsible for these people too. We think that's a fine and good thing. But we think that this hinges on this idea of contribution. It hinges on the idea that the state is responsible for people at the point at which they give something back to the state. We think that these people aren't going to be able to do that, and for that reason the state has no responsibility to let them in. That's why we think we're legitimate, right? So, no thanks. So, similarly, we think it makes it difficult for these people to integrate, not just in terms of actually tangibly contributing to the state. It also makes it really difficult for them to integrate into our culture. It makes it really like, we think it's fine for people to have their own culture and stuff like that, but we think at the point where they fundamentally disagree with the overarching principles, it becomes difficult to engage with anyone in, like, with the people that live in that state on a fundamental level. We think that's harmful to them. It's also harmful to our own citizens because of what I'm about to get onto now, which is my second point about backlash. No, thank you. Okay, so we think that as a state, we want the greatest amount of happiness for the most amount of our citizens that we can. We want the greatest benefit out of it, right? So we think that at the point that these people can potentially destroy this happiness, or to make it more difficult, or make it less people, right? We think the state needs to take a firm hand and try to maintain the peace and maintain that that happiness of the people, right? So why do we think this is a problem? Well, we think because what happens is when they openly dispute our fundamental principles and stuff like that, they're going to spread those views to other people. So I think what happens is at the point at which they see somebody who's perhaps living in this country and talks about, they get into a conversation in a pub or something like that about how, welfare system or whatever, if they get into a conversation about any kind of overarching principle, right? We think they're going to be quite angry at the point that these people are saying that, they're happy with it, because they're going to be like, why? Because they fundamentally disagree with it and they're just not going to be able to see their point of view. But what does this mean, right? We think that what happens is that they spread their views to these other people. And it has the potential to spark seeds of discontent where there doesn't necessarily need to be any discontent, right? So we think that how do we know the discontent is bad? Because I'm sure all we're going to tell you the discontent is great and it makes the state accountable and all this kind of stuff, right? Okay, at the point with which it's fundamental principles, the people who are living in our state have voted for them. They voted for principles like democracy and stuff like that. We know that these are things that they're happy with. We know that these are things that they don't necessarily want to question. So the point that somebody else comes in and starts spreading a discontent, we think that that's actually not beneficial to the state. We think it actually makes it harder for the state to govern. It kind of undermines them. Because we think what happens is if the people within that state, if a citizen of a country wants to object to something about the state or a principle of the state, that's absolutely fine because they are a citizen of that state and it's something that they are a part of, right? But we think if people are going to object, it needs to be for the right reasons. It's not coming from a place of hatred or coming from a place of we just don't like your overarching principles of democracy because it's not consistent with our whatever. So for all these reasons, for the reasons that Joe's going to give you in a minute, I'm going to.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech and call upon Andreas to open the case for the opposition and for Stuttgart. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about four things in rebuttal and construction. Firstly, why universal human rights shouldn't be conditioned on whether you like LGBT people or not. Secondly, talking a lot about where values come from and why therefore we can't find out reliably what your opinions and your true heart of heart is. Thirdly, why did we dispute a link between, for example, homophobic thoughts and homophobic actions, and why we shouldn't introduce a concept of thought crime, almost. And fourthly, why immigrants can be useful in many ways, and through this usefulness, their values can change, which is a good thing. All rebuttal is integrated. Okay, let's first talk about a bit about human rights, because the Prime Minister kind of glossed over this whole asylum point. We say they give asylum out of universal human brother and sisterhood, out of solidarity for those who are most in need or who are most persecuted in the world. And we say we shouldn't make this contingent on any condition whatsoever, whatever is in their head. If somebody is a freedom fighter, for example, from Iran, what happens to say that he or she hates LGBT people, or is somehow a bit crazy in a way? Gandhi, for example, used to sleep naked with young girls all the time. We would call him a pedophile today, but still we would say let's take in even these flawed freedom fighters because the values they fight for are more important and higher prioritized than those thoughts they claim to have. Because their actions, in this case, speak louder than their words, and therefore we say let's not put any conditions on asylum. Let's talk secondly about where values come from, because we didn't hear how exactly they're proposing to test for which values and opinions these people are having. Is it an answer to this question, fellows? Yeah?
Did you just say that you are now for complete open borders?
No, you can of course put restrictions on immigration. You can't take in 1 million asylum seekers because our resources are limited, or maybe we only want people who have work or are capable of working. That's entirely okay, but we say don't put this kind of value litmus test. Because it's not going to work, right? Because we say humans are very social creatures, so they take many cues from society, from the family, from the media, from the religion, etc. And because people generally don't want to stand out uncomfortably, therefore they imbibe the values of their society. And it might also be very dangerous to, for example, to say, I don't hate gay people in Saudi Arabia, right? Or you might just seem crazy because everybody else claims to be very heterosexual and hating on gays, and if you're saying I don't, it just seems crazy. So it's hard to emancipate yourself from the culture you're coming from, and it's too tall in order to ask for normal people who often are not very political either. They don't care much either way, so just parrot what the culture at large says, because they also, moreover, don't have any experience or exposure with gay people in, for example, Saudi Arabia or Iran, because they just can't stick out their heads, because the head might be locked off, right? And moreover, we think it's often also a cultural mark of belonging to say that you are very religious, even if secretly you are atheist, for example, or if you don't care or even are gay yourself. You say that you hate them, or you say that you are very religious because your family expects it from you, your society expects it from you, and also in this case, and otherwise you will get a problem with your family. So in all, we say we can't see into people's brains, we can't see into the heart of hearts, because they will either say, if they're not compelled to say, yes, I am very religious, and yes, I hate LGBT people, they will just say, if you ask them, do you hate gays? And they know that their immigration status hinges on it, they say, no, I don't. Well, right? So we can't test them, and only the stupid and crippling honest people will be caught, and this is just an unfair procedure. I take a POI now.
Okay.
No.
Let's be fair to the opening, right? They didn't say we're going to stop people coming into a country who don't agree with gay marriage. They said we're going to stop people who want to say things like hang the gays, or kill the gays, or the gays don't have a right to exist in society.
Well, it's just a bit more of extremism to say I don't like gays, so we should hang them. As long as, okay, let's move on to the next point. We don't see a link between thoughts and words and actions. Right? We don't see it in our native homophobes, even though we have many homophobes in the US and the UK and Germany, wherever, we don't see a massive wave of hate crimes happening. It's too much, but still isolated circumstances. So we don't see why here spreading opinions wouldn't necessarily happen in the first place. I'll talk about that a bit later. But even if they spread their homophobic opinions, firstly, there's a minority, so minority opinions, well, there's lots of minority opinions, but as long as the majority is okay with it, that's okay with us. And even if it would spread a bit, we don't see, as long as they don't prove to us an imminent link between thoughts and actions, we don't see why this would be any kind of big problem in this instance. Okay, let's talk a bit why we kind of really like immigrants. We heard from the Prime Minister, oh, they don't want to settle down. Well, why are they immigrating then? We see in this will to immigration already a will to settle down, right? So they already want to do something in our country. Or otherwise they're asylum seekers, which means they're persecuted, which means they have no choice. So it's kind of unfair to say you don't want to settle down. They have no choice but to flee to somewhere where there might be more open arms. And then she said, oh, what is it if they don't want to integrate? Well, help them integrate, avoid ghettoization, give them language courses or whatever. Only let them in if they have a job secured or something, so they don't fall into welfare or something. There are many ways to prevent like ghettoization and like separation of people. And I also think if these precautions are in place, there will be some integration through work. Through, for example, having to work with women or having to work with LGBT people, and thereby getting these experiences which you couldn't get in Saudi Arabia or Iran or wherever, and therefore also beginning to change their values, because then they're in a another culture where they can imbibe the values of that culture. And this also helps to open the discourse instead of like entrenching it from top down by saying our values are like that, and if you don't conform to this very narrow model of what our values are, you're not welcome here. And many native people wouldn't conform to this narrow set of values set from top down with some magic confetti or whatever. And we don't want, we want values to come up from bottom up and people to imbibe them in this way, and also they construct values in this way. So for these reasons, because we think human rights shouldn't be contingent on anything, because you can't find out what their actual values are, because we don't see a link between thoughts and actions, and fourthly, because immigrants can be very useful and values can be constructed through cooperation, we are proud of the process.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for his fine speech and call upon Joe from Strathclyde to continue the case for first proposition. Hear, hear.
Sorry, it's going to be second. Well, that was awkward. I've got 2 points to bring you. Firstly, we're going to talk about the metrics and the way in which we normally, allow immigration, and talk about previous kind of, precedent we have that's all about integration. Then we're going to take opening opposition and probably all closing opposition to the highest burden, and we tell how this actually makes the lives of other asylum seekers much worse. Tons of rebuttal. One, we've got this idea about it's all nice to have fluffy human rights, we should all care about these other people, and that's all absolutely fantastic. To a certain extent, we agree. However, their burdens to tell us why it is not just a nice thing, but a morally obligatory thing for the states to accept these kinds of people. The reason why that isn't the case is because it is not necessarily certain this is necessarily the best way in which to take care of these people who happen to be taken away. There are other ways, such as trading with them, such as spreading human rights, such as consistently being involved in the ECHR or the UN or other ways. Therefore, for them to show us that, that we should somehow care about the general utility of all citizens and abandon the idea of the artificial states which you think have a lot of utility good, then you have to tell us why it's the only way and the best way to help people, which we don't think that it is. Okay. Right. Secondly, let's just get on to kind of Ben kind of took away my word here. The point is that we aren't we're going to allow people who just might have a bit of a problem with the idea of religious marriage. Where we do have a problem is people actively going to make the lives of homosexuals in that society a lot worse. We think that the state's role is much more important to kind of garner its own citizens who happen to have these values and will be persecuted and abused by these kinds of people. We don't care, right? We don't care how abused these people are at the point where they're going to make the abuse of other people a lot worse. Thirdly, let's get this let's get onto the idea about how, oh my goodness, it's thought crime. It's terrible because we're going to be interrogating them. Two responses to that. One, Tala's myth. We're not going to do this. Secondly, the motion, it's openly, they must openly, actively be against these things. And when we ask them, are you going to be against these things, and they say no, then we think that's probably okay, unless they have a history of it, which is what Tala said. It's not thought crime, it's not interrogation, it has to be open. The reason why that is because the more open it is they're going to be active in the state, making things worse, and trying to kind of, make it worse for other people. Fourthly, he tells us this idea about how, we can, he says, well, we can help educate them, or why else are they here? Well, the point is that if they're here over other states and they happen to have a moral disagreement with this state, then we suggest that their motives, Mr. Speaker, are quite perverse, right? We don't think that their motive are ever actually going to be to integrate, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, we don't think we ever can, at the point where they would have other states to choose and to go there. We think at the point where they actively, openly disagree with those principles, we think that's fine. One, why is it necessary to appease people who actually might have these kind of right-wing views, and what is the precedent with which we allow immigration? Because here's the thing, we must at the very least agree to live together collectively. We must at the very least agree to have collective action, and we all must be together, and that must be fine, right? Why is that the case? Well, essentially, here's the thing. Because where else do we allow other immigration, right? We allow other immigration at a point where it can integrate effectively. That's why we don't have open borders, right? Because the huge amount of influx of immigration would have absolutely no incentive to make cultural ties with people around them, because they have their own cultural ties to make, right? This is very similar as what Tala brings you. Because they have no incentive to make cultural friendship ties with people who live in this society, because they're so juxtaposed to their culture and their frame of morality, they will never, ever integrate. That is the metric by which we allow immigration, right? That has just been absolutely perfect for us because that is the tipping point where which the state can determine at the point where things are going to get a lot more worse if we allow these immigrants to ever come in. Because collective identity is essentially what the state is all about, right? At the point where you make that worse and you harm the discourse of people, that is extremely problematic, right? Let's talk about other asylum seekers. Before I go ahead.
So if an Iranian guy who's a gay person once then became a freedom fighter and seeks asylum in our country, you just send him back to die.
He became a freedom. Sorry, is that?
He became a freedom fighter afterwards.
So after living in our country, he suddenly became a freedom fighter. Right. Okay. Well, let's just take them on the highest order, because they generally have this idea, and we kind of agree with them, that it's good to allow people who are genuinely disadvantaged and who genuinely want to enter into the state due to asylum. This makes this so much more difficult. Why? Because Tala tells you a backlash comes into play at the point where the kind of right wing, the very popular rhetoric, how much will work is to say, look, these guys are taking our jobs, these guys are making our lives not work. It's going to get a hell of a lot worse at the point where they can visibly see people who are against their very moral frame of right. You think, how many times do you see in the news people say, I don't mind immigrants as long as they kind of follow world culture? And when you make that backlash actively worse, what happens, Mr. Speaker? We think that this backlash is quite confused. See the status quo. How many people do you think who are pretty racist and pretty naive don't really know the difference between an economic migrant and an asylum seeker? They tend to get the two concepts confused. I.e., they're coming in to steal my jobs, or they're coming in here and not paying any benefits. So thus, the right-wing rhetoric is already confused, and it paints people with the same brush. We suggest a much more perverse thing will happen under this model. No thank you. Is that people who are normal asylum seekers, who want to integrate, will now be painted by the same brush because they will not be allowed to integrate because they essentially have the same backlash put on them. Why is this? Because if you accept that the discourse is already confused, and this is the top point, if we now add another layer of people who are extraordinarily bad, then everyone else's discourse shifts up, right? Everyone, the popularity of economic migrants, they receive even more backlash. The reputation of asylum seekers, they receive even more backlash at the point where the far right backlash is already affecting people who are essentially the asylum seekers who want to follow morality. But also they're actually much more likely to actually deter the state from ever being able to help people who all of opposition wants to help. And for those reasons and the reasons that Tala gave you, I beg you to oppose.
Very good. I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his fine speech and call upon Michael to continue the case of Stuttgart. Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, about integration and how you integrate people properly. Secondly, about diversity and how diversity is important and how this proposal will undermine it. But before that, a few points of rebuttal. So we have the first proposition that these people might not have any contribution and thus we should send them back. I mean, the motion is very clear. They are either immigrants to come here for work. There are limitations on this in the first place. So if they don't have a job lined up, every country has to decide that. They can put limitations on that. So they say, and this is what happens when I get a work visa for a country, I lose my job, I have to go back to the original country. So they will contribute them, so you can enforce that. So there's no problem here. The second case is asylum seekers, and we haven't talked about them at all. And so you lose it on that count completely. So we say, and this is what I'm arguing later on, that this is a basic human right, and thus you should enforce it because you shouldn't send back people to die, and it's highly immoralistic, and we shouldn't do that even if we disagree with their personal views. Then secondly, you're saying it's going to cause a huge backlash. These people are going to plant the seeds of discontent within society. You say this is false. First, within our society, we have public discourse that can rein them in. It's a stable public discourse because we have our opinions as well. And people aren't going to get shocked as soon as they see them. Secondly, they are not very good at articulating themselves. For example, if they hear me with a funny accent bashing gays, they feel like a crazy person. What is going on? In the contrary, they are not going to spread it further. Quite often they just keep it to themselves. And with time, that's what Andreas argued, they quite often change because they see, it's not a big deal here. Then next point is, well, this whole point that you misunderstood Andreas' question. So it's about people who come to seek for asylum. For example, Christians from the Middle East who come and who might have extreme views on certain particular points, who will die if they go back. For example, people who converted from Islam to Christianity. If they go back, say, to Pakistan, they will die there. Personally, they might tell you on a questionnaire, we hate gays. If you send them back, they will die. It's a certainty in certain cases. Essentially, you're killing them for ticking the wrong box. And we say this case, and this is a tall order also for the second proposition, if you can't answer this case, you're killing a certain fraction of people with certainty. And we say we shouldn't do this. Next point of rebuttal. You're saying, oh, it's only a questionnaire. But then, I mean, this is like the tiniest amount of fraction of people who will tick that box. Like the cripplingly stupid people, like when you have this ESTA thing for the American immigration thing, where you tick certain boxes, you know, are you a terrorist? And you're like, oh yes, sure, I'm a terrorist. These people wouldn't tick these boxes, so I'm arguing. Your metric is useless, because everybody can sort of gloss over it very simply. If you don't have any tough regulation on it, you're taking all the advantages of your case, but none of the disadvantages of not being able to look into their hearts of hearts. And this is highly problematic, because in the end, only your rhetoric, it's only lip service what you're saying, because essentially all the people that you're looking for, you can't catch in the first place with your useless rhetoric. So either you have a robust mechanism that works, or you don't have anything at all. Then it's only yet another BNP kind of proposal that's right that English is the language of England. It's like, yeah, do that. Who cares, right? That's the same with your kind of proposal. And then let's get to my first point about integration. We say integrating is very important for a country to try to make an honest effort to understand these people, even when they have extreme views. Because quite often, these views were imparted on them by society. They're not gay-bashing or like anti-democratic by themselves, they are just quite often unpolitical and bystanding within that society. And we say this is very important to recognize as human psychology. Quite often when they stay in a country, Turks in Germany, for example, or in other countries as well, where they are there for a very long time, they become more moderate. They let their children do things that they wouldn't have allowed in their own countries. And this moderation, which you can observe in a vast majority of countries, is something that you completely neglected here. That's like the vast majority within these groups really tones down. They build associations, and within those, they are contributing and good, flexible kind of minority within the country. Now, if we have like these inflexible kind of entry regulations that you have here, the first, at the beginning, these people don't feel welcome, because as soon as they enter, somebody tells them from the top, well, what you do isn't right, what you do is wrong, and we say this is bad because then you oppose yourself against these people just for the fun of it, because you despise them and you say, I'm not going to accept if somebody from the top tells me something. Then let's talk about the motion itself again. So two cases, right? Either they are asylum seekers, and we say here, human rights should trump. Why? Because we acknowledge as one of our inherent values that they are universal. So even if they are like the biggest dickheads that you could think of, we still shouldn't let them die. That's also why we don't have the death penalty within our countries. We say we should acknowledge our responsibility to human rights, and we have already. That's like a consented kind of view in this half of the debate. Anyways, and so it's very important to uphold this value, not maybe even necessarily for that person, but for ourselves, to reflect within our society that we take our responsibility very, very seriously, and that we even would do it for these very extreme cases. So say, and sometimes it's even that it's linked to us, say we have like somebody in Denmark having a Mohammed caricature, right? Christians in the Middle East might die because of that, because they are close to these extreme regions. Then they might seek for asylum within Europe, and we send them essentially back under your proposal because they have very extreme views. Essentially, we have some kind of responsibility because of globalization. They come to us, ask us for help so they don't die, and we send them back to these countries where they get prosecuted. And we think this is a serious mistake. Your question.
Okay, so at the point where they probably have other states where which they can choose to live, yet they choose to live in this state where they openly
no. This is bullshit. Somebody has to pick up the problem. Somebody has to pick up the order. One country has to make this decision, and the West is usually the only ones that can do it because they have the resources and everything. The country that is faced with this problem has to deal with it. You can't say, well, then they should go to a different country. That's only dodging the question. If you had such a person applying, you'd have to deal with the case. Second point that we bring in is diversity. These people are quite often gateway to their own countries. They become genuine contributors to our country while they turn down because we've integrated them properly. We say quite often they change over time, and just to go to your extreme case, even if we have the most extreme case within such minority community, we say a small grain of salt might even help us. If we become aware that these extreme positions exist, and we are able to observe them within our community, that can be a good thing within the public discourse. This is why societies that are extremely homogeneous are so shaken when they hear something like this for the first time. It's very productive if you have a small doses of poison, essentially, in that sense, that helps you to become more aware of these problems and to establish a robust public discourse around it, where you can discuss it and try to convince these people. You can't convince these people in the other countries, but you can do it within this country. And this is a lot easier, because you already have, like, usually surrounding them an immigration community that is less moderate. And this is very good, because then you can re-influence that more extreme fringes within that society. And we think this is how you could crack down on this problem in the first place. You could keep 99 of the people who are alright, who will change over time, and then even influence that one person, and that will teach the rest of society how to deal with these conflicts, instead of like being shaken for the first time. It's like people who enter the internet for the first time and are like, oh God, what is in here? Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his fine speech, and call upon the Ben to open the case for St. Andrews in the second half of next year.
Oh, Kill. Oh God. Lame. Retire. Right. I can do some more heckling. Mr. Speaker, we think the top half were downright when they said that threats to our values translated to threats to our people. I'm going to extend firstly on that and tell you why that is exactly true. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit more about legitimacy and grounds on which we can compromise what is apparently a human right. Third, I'm going to talk to you about why it's better not to let them in, to try and let them in and deport them. Before that, I have a few points of rebuttal. First of all, on the universality of human rights, we should all be tolerant. We like human rights, and we like being tolerant. We point out that human rights and tolerance are the kind of values that our society stands for. Those people who come in are going to say, no, we don't think human rights shouldn't apply at all. We don't think everyone should be equal. If we're going to have a kind of society which is tolerant, which you feel okay being a Hindu or okay being a gay, exactly the kind of people we want to keep out. For those who want to say, no, it's not true to be a gay, it's not okay to be a Hindu, you are a priori out of our society. It's like saying that just because we think there's a right against arbitrary imprisonment, thinks we shouldn't lock up people who've committed crimes. The point at which you have taken concrete steps to deny those values of tolerance and human rights, and that you are going to do so in the future, that's you become an outrage to the very values that they say justifies allowing them in the first place. Moreover, they make the concession that these human rights aren't universal when they say that we have caps on immigration to keep people out due to lack of resources. Lack of resources presumably is okay because that leads to harms for people who have to supply those resources, i.e. the people inside, right? Well, if we're hammering on the basis of resource lack leads to harms bad, we have a justified lie. If we think justified lies exist, that's our side. And secondly, those human rights clearly aren't absolute and are susceptible to qualification. Secondly, let's deal with on the point of these prosecuted people. First of all, the majority of people who are going to come in and promulgate these views, let's not screw around, are extremist creatures from countries like Iran, from Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan, right? That is not the kind of place where you are likely to be under threat if you say you want to hang the gays, right? Secondly, those people, those freedom fighters who stand up for liberal values in Iran, right? Those people are overwhelmingly on our side of the debate, Madam Speaker, against those kinds of values. They're not going to be the kind of people who think we should arbitrarily kill people on the basis of their sexuality. Thirdly, that we are in some way morally responsible for the death. Let's not fuck around. We don't pull the trigger. We don't pull the trigger, right? Somebody else is responsible for that, based on the actions that they take, right? That is where the moral responsibility lies. Fourthly, that we're going to have loads of Coptic Christians, for example, not be allowed into our country. Those people are not the kind of people facing a history of prosecution who are going to say things like, we want to prosecute and kill the gays. They might be anti-gay, right? We're happy to accept that. That's not what Opening Gov gave you. They gave you where we're going to take concrete steps to persecute, to imprison, to concretely, materially hurt those people. That's not the kind of thing that the majority of Coptic Christians, for example, believe or would want to stand for in a society that came through, given they themselves understand how bad that can be. Fourth, next point of rebuttal. But thoughts do not lead to action, and my religious convictions do not motivate the way I behave. What's weird is that most people go to Mass seem to do so because they think it's going to make God happy. You're going to get a lot of people going to that because they don't happen to be Catholics. We think if you hold a religious belief that the way to get 72 virgins in heaven is to act in a homophobic, or to act in an anti-Hindu, or to act in this way, in that certain way, of course that's going to enter into the matrix upon which you make your decisions of action, Mr. Speaker. Finally, that they will feel threatened if we have to ask them what their values are and to assert our values at the point of entry. First of all, we think that is to an extent okay, because they are going to have to abide by our laws. They are going to have to abide by our values. And to assert what those are, for, at least what those are in the way they behave from the start, isn't a threat. That's okay. It's like saying they'll be threatened because we have to ask them to abide by our laws. Right, extension material. Why values translate to threats to us? First of all, in immigration, these people are right on the top half to say that we want them to liberalise in certain ways. We think it's very bad to be a woman within an Islamic ghetto in Britain. We think that these are the kind of places we'd like to develop freedom of religion. The problem is, these pastors will lose power if they allow that immigration. Because the more they move away from those Iranian or those Islamic views, the local community moves away from those views, the less power those individuals command in society, in that society. So they're always going to have an incentive to take and push the most hardline form of their religion to prop up their own power. Secondly, in terms of radicalization, there are a lot of young and angry people who come to our country and live in these ghettos, right? But what you do is you hand them a framework and a rhetoric that says the problem with that can be expressed through this preset belief of ideology that we've already got really well worked out and we already believe in, and we can tell you exactly what you should do. You should attack that society. You should fight back against that society and a priori reject its values. We don't think you get that same strong rhetoric. We don't have these people in. Moreover, they're exactly the kind of people who, when anti-immigration backlash does happen, and they make anti-immigration backlash far more likely because they tend to be most vocal about the most offensive views, not to back down or concede to that, but to say, look, exactly what I told you is coming true. The fascists are coming for us. This entire society is against us, and provoke violence and more problems and escalate those problems that exist because it feeds into their rhetoric. Finally, in terms of homegrown terrorists, we point to things like 7/7 and Glasgow bombing were homegrown terrorists, right? We think that these people contribute to environments in which those views are not pointed out or turned into the police, the point at which they tend to be, on the whole, more radical. It can happen, of course it can, with things like the internet, but it's much more difficult if you haven't got a face-to-face contact and a supporting community to validate your views.
So how would you have found about these people with your proposal?
Well, like these people who all had contact with people who come into our country and set themselves up as local imams in local mosques, right? That is something that happens from people who come from Pakistan or come from Saudi Arabia and spread those values. Even if not all of them are, a significant proportion are, and on the comparative it's better. Secondly, legitimate. We do think legitimate. Actually, I'm going to skip legitimacy to the end, but let's talk about letting them in. Third point, we think letting them in is worse for a number of reasons. First of all, because they're hard to get rid of once they are here, right? As we've seen in cases where we try to deport people, it's an incredibly lengthy legal process. Not only does that mean we can't get rid of them, but also it means that they become martyrs for the cause, right? That once they're already in, they've built up a groundswell supporting those local communities, they can use that as an example of the victimization. Because they do often come in and use themselves, we're talking about these extremist pastors, right, who are letting in these hate speech people. They do set themselves up to a certain extent as part of the local community and part of these community leaders, right? So that any backlash against them or attempts to get them out, they've already told the local people what to think. They've told them, the state will come for me. It's a sign that they don't agree with you. They've already indoctrinated that group of people to fight back violently against attempts to remove them. We think that just feeds more into narratives of victimization. Finally, because they are very hard to track and prosecute, right? There's very real failings of the security services. In the case of 7/7, in the case of the Glasgow bombings, where we couldn't find and we couldn't track these people once they had already come into the country. Not only because they tend to interact with a very large amount of people, but because they don't tend to commit things that are obviously, utterly crimes, even though they do lead to incredibly bad consequences, like the spreading of terrorist values, right? They just contribute in softer and less easy to prosecute ways to that process, which makes them extremely damaging. So, because we think it's better not to let them in than to get rid of them, because we think their values do translate in concrete harm to a very tragic
Right, after that brief timing worry there, we are now ready to continue on to Sheffield. As a member of the opposition, here.
Cool. Joe admits right at the beginning of his case that basically we don't have a very nuanced understanding of immigration, we don't have a nuanced understanding of the asylum system. We think that's precisely the problem, is that these are the kinds of things where we say freedom of speech and freedom of expression aren't absolute. that we don't have a responsibility to protect individuals, we end up with a worse asylum system which provides unable to actually achieve its aims, but also the tarring of people with a certain brush. That's the two things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about asylum systems and we're going to talk about interaction within the state. Before that, let's call it 8 pieces of rebuttal. Let's deal with the first half first. So, predominant values. Like, as first opposition rightly point out, there are people within this state who don't hold the predominant values that are shared within the society. Well, first proposition tell you the problem with these people coming in is that they are in some way difficult to govern and therefore not deserving of citizenship and not deserving the rights of being in this state. We think that's a problematic message at the point at which we say you are difficult to govern, you're not somehow worthy of that citizenship in terms of the spread of that value within society. At that point, sorry to criticise America, Jordan, we end up with the kind of value which says to criticise your government is unpatriotic. We think that's problematic. Secondly, they label these people as not willing to help the community, and that's the reason they shouldn't be let in. No, like, the beautiful thing about our lovely liberal state is the fact that we accept that the state is not perfect in any way. What we say is that when we allow these individuals to come in and alter that value set, we have to allow that absolute value of freedom of speech, because that is the only way the kinds of absolute important values can anyway be changed in a meaningful way at a future date, something which we always accept is possible within a liberal state. Then they say that, oh, but they may say bad things. Like, we think the point at which those harms become tangible when they say things, then we have laws to protect against that things. We'd point to the Obscene Publications Act. We'd point to things like incitement to racial hatred. These things exist already at the point at which they do a bad thing. Different scenario, tangible harms versus just holding or expressing that view in the first place. Fourthly, Joe lists some alternative methods, i.e. we could apply pressure through something like the ECHR. Well, that's kind of problematic at the point at which we ignore the core values within things like the ECHR, like freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Kind of a self-defeating case there. Like, then we get this idea coming out of Byrne, like, oh, we have to make some decision about how one right can trump another. Never provides us a calculus as to why the right to have people defend our country comes over and above something like the right to life of an individual who would die in another state. We think, like, we're quite happy to say on a basic level, right to life trumps right to freedom of speech. Grand will have these people in. Finally, like, we'd like to ask what we're actually debating after Byrne's speech, because he eliminates people who have vaguely similar values to us, like Coptic Christians. No, they're not in the debate. But we're also not talking about people people who hold Islamic views and stuff, because they'd never try and gain Islamic entrance to the UK in the first place, because they love being in Iran. Who actually is trying to emigrate to this country with different values to us after Byrne's speech? So firstly, asylum system. Like, opening top opposition give you some stuff about why asylum is a generally good idea in terms of protecting the rights of people. Opening Gov from Joe's banging there seems to agree with us. Right, couple of problems with this. Firstly, domestically. Like, as Joe accepts, there is a lack of nuanced understanding when it comes to the immigration and the asylum system. Like, you say that admit that we can't help, people don't know the difference between an economic migrant and asylum system, like you explicitly say. A couple of problems with this. Like, the only way that we can effectively deal with this kind of situation, the kind of rhetoric that exists, is essentially to create a black and white situation, which is to turn around and say that there is an absolute value that we place upon the asylum system and individuals coming in. What they want to be able to do is create a value judgment at the point at which we say, well, this freedom of speech is worth defending someone for, this freedom of speech isn't worth judging for. We create a value as to which asylum seekers are good, which asylum seekers are bad. But because of that lack of nuanced understanding of things like the asylum system, that's something that's capitalized by people who are invested in establishing things like right-wing narratives when it comes to the asylum system, because they view it as a tacit acceptance of the fact that asylum seekers can and will be bad people in certain situations. You have to create that black and white in order to avoid that system emerging in the first place. But we think there's also an international dimension at the point at which we create the asylum system in the first place on the basis that we construct a value of freedom of speech and freedom of expression as being something universal and something that has to be defended under all circumstances. Hence, we extend almost our responsibility to outside of the world. The point at which we say, well, no, if you disagree with someone's speech, then you don't have to let them have freedom of speech, hence we don't have to let these people in. That kind of is detrimental to the message that we're giving to places like Saudi Arabia or Iran when we say you do have to allow freedom of speech, because then they get to kick people out who disagree with them. That's your Christians in Egypt. Duh. Right.
Okay, we agree that sending the message that they're actually bad might be problematic for their asylum seekers. Our message is louder at the point where people get to see them being bad rather than this weird abstract government message that they're bad. That was our case.
No. Like, we think people are perfectly aware of the fact that legislation changes. Like, they're not idiots. Look at the fact of look at something like the reclassification of cannabis, and people recognise it moving from Class C to Class B. They're happy to look at that. People do recognise that. Political parties, particularly, would say UKIP, the British National Party, are perfectly able to recognise that, capitalise it, and say those kinds of things. Like, we think that we still win. Right. Secondly, interaction within the state. Couple of points on this. The first thing is that we label these people with contradictory or alternative values, essentially as being someone that we can't integrate with. That is the explicit point that first proposition bring you when we say that's why we can't have them in the country. That's why we can't have people in the community. We think that's exceptionally problematic at the point at which they also want to defend democratic values, i.e. the necessity of forming a community by interacting with people who disagree with you and hold contradictory values. You can't have both at the same time, guys. Like, either you support interaction with those people or you don't. They want it both ways. We'd plot for democracy over their message. Secondly, though, we say that we begin to see tarring of individuals with the same brush based on the places that their views emanate from. The point at which Abu Hamza is kicked out of the country, we turn around and say that his values were Islamic in some way, and therefore it is that is the value set that needs to be challenged. We say the problem with that is that we see a labelling effect because of the lack of nuanced media that First Prop exists, as all Muslims, as certainly being in some way tarred with that same brush of being extreme. They harm interaction with society, they harm the asylum system. For those reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for also continuing to address during his speech, and call upon Alex to close the case for the proposition.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, you know you've not been debating for too long when apparently people have changed institutions, because I swear you were at Dyer like at least a year ago, and now apparently I'm Sheffield. This is all very good. But that aside, I want to talk about 4 main points of crash. A little bit looking at the MEC, because there seems to be some weird confusion, which was a very simple, intuitive MEC, on a little bit looking at who's being turned away, the impact on immigrants, and the impact of these breaches on the wider society. Now, the MEC we were given was unbelievably black and white. There are 2 facets which we don't let people in. There was a box that we have saying, are you in line with the crucial fundamental facets of our ideology and our demagogue? And if they tick this box and say yes, we let them in. If they don't, as they say no, then we don't. This is pretty equivalent to the are you a terrorist box on the entrance to America with English 90. But the more important facet of this is that there is also a background check. As clearly stated in the MEC, that if you have an explicit history of preaching ideas totally contrary to the ideology of the nation, then you should also not be allowed. Why is this relevant? Well, they, in first prop, couch this in the terms of looking at exactly why people who would take this box aren't welcome in society. We think that was fair. We, in extension, couch this specifically in the terms of extremist Islamic preachers, ones who have an established track record of anti-Western, anti-ideological views, who explicitly have stated hate speech outside of Britain, and then come legally, as they do currently, into Britain and espouse these views in the ghettos of Islamic extremism within the UK, and why this is a bad thing. We think this is an important facet, and the MEC confusion doesn't really stand when you actually look at the data being couched. Now, we had some basic responses to this, people being like, okay, so what are these views? We think it is possible with the consultation of perhaps some sort of independent judicial think tank to find out what we stand for and what we really don't want people in. We were also told, but there's people already in the nation with these views. That's not an argument to let more people in. We should say, okay, it's kind of a double standard saying he's not like, gay bashing terrorist, so let's let in another gay bashing terrorist. We think that's unfair. We also think that when they stand up and say, what about when we turn away people like, and these were his exact words in the POI, Iranian freedom fighters who perhaps hit a gay, and why, we should let them in because they fight for human rights. Now, this was the first top case. Why do we think human rights are somewhat incompatible with gay bashing? Why do we think the arguments that were given us weren't entirely relevant in the context of that debate? More specifically, we think that the word freedom fighter and human rights is too abstract to be used in any real sense of our position. I don't think he meant Iranian freedom fighters, there are no Iranian freedom fighters, there's secular groups within Iran who don't like the government. You might have meant Iraqi freedom fighters who are Al-Qaeda, or Afghanistani freedom fighters who are Taliban. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Being a freedom fighter should not be a constituent requirement for entering the nation. We think it's argued that this is a hole in our net. Ignores the fact that these are often people we wouldn't really be wanting preaching their dialogues within our country. More specifically, we think that they implicitly accept there should be a limit on immigrants, thus kind of conceding the case on why there is an absolute human right. But more generally, surely it's just an intuitive argument that if there's a limit on immigrants, why not just limit it to the people who don't tick the box saying, I hate gay people? Some immigrants in say, I quite like gay people and I'm more conducive towards the dialogue within your nation, and why this is inherently a good thing. We think that's an intuitive piece of argumentation, and one that's also received no response. I'll let the top half respond. Go ahead.
If everyone in your country actively oppresses women, and that is the normal thing to do, why do you expect people to be exceptional?
Because when they come into our nation, if they personally hold beliefs contrary to that cultural consensus they have now fled, they won't tick the box saying, I actively hate women, and they won't have an established track record in any meaningful sense that would stand up in a court judiciously this saying, I have hated women. We're talking about preachers who write entire pamphlets on why women are the sin, and why women showing flesh is the sin, and these women should be stoned. We're not talking about someone who once went to mass, and in that mass there was a man who once said that girls perhaps weren't as great as boys. We think that's a very politically response to the argumentation we've given you. So let's actually look at this more in detail. So first of all, the impact on the immigrants themselves, the people who are coming into this nation, and the people already here. Well, we think, first of all, that the vast majority of these people, the general immigrants who need asylum, or want to go to jobs, or want to relocate, are doing it for the right reasons, and consequently are filtered out by the Met quite sufficiently. But more generally, the immigrants we already have within our nation, we think, benefit from this, because there is less of a political dialogue or a news dialogue around the demagogue preachers who preach the things that seem so inherently anti-British, and which the public instantly associate with Muslims generally. But in this is a somewhat intuitive piece of analysis. If you have less people who are making the front lines with a hook for a hand and a whole lot of paint, then you perhaps will stop looking at Muslims with those same eyes. We think this is inherently good for the image of Islam within our society, and a fundamental benefit brought to you. Why is this so relevant towards what Ben brought you? Because these people, these individuals, are the ones who are most relevant. These imams and preachers are the ones who bring the most harm to the local community and the most harm to the Islamic image. So let's look at the impact of these preachers in the two terms we brought you. The first that was kind of flashed with by Pete, and the other that was completely ignored, ergo defend, because apparently that's a bit of a nasty burden to try and discharge while terrorists kill people, and people with proven links to terrorists who still enter the country probably are bad. Because that was never mentioned once in this rebuttal, specifically why these people do have links that we should perhaps be questioned. Now we were told at a point of information, but look, we still kind of caught these people who committed these terrorist acts. Well, for a start, we didn't catch 7-7, that caught us, but more explicitly, we caught the people who tried to bomb Glasgow Airport as they stumbled through the door in a flaming vehicle. We think, good job, security services, really not that out of the park. Those individuals are already in the middle of their terrorist act, and by some sheer luck, no one was harmed. We don't think that's a damning incitement of anything other than serious failures of the current paradigm, where we allow these creatures in so perhaps we can track them for security purposes. No. What these creatures do is they explicitly, operate in independent paradigms that are easily followable by any meaningful sense, because when you're preaching to 150 angry, youthful, and disenfranchised Muslims who feel isolated and abandoned by the state, then perhaps it's not entirely feasible to track every one of those, follow every one of those, and ensure every single one of those people doesn't become a terrorist. More specifically, a huge amount of the argumentation brought to you by opposition, this is a really interesting thing, has been around the harms of ghettoization and the impact on the Islamic population. We've also been arguing for those harms. We've been aggressively agreeing with each other for quite a lot of debate. In fact, no one seems to have noticed. We all think ghettoization is bad. What we brought you is that ghettoization is made perniciously worse when you have people coming into those ghettos and saying, we should build bigger walls. We should isolate ourselves up even further away from society. We should withdraw even closer into Sharia law and separate ourselves explicitly from the Western government that you hate and I hate and we should all hate. We think this is a clear, concrete harm that is yet to be addressed. Ghettoization is bad. Complete lack of integration is bad. These preachers, these people we would filter out with our model, are entirely justified. Often need to give us a principled, well-analysed case as to why it is a duty of a Western liberal government to allow everyone in to discuss their views and air their views. The preemptive bit of kind of rebuttal I'm giving there is that a Western liberal government is built upon an underlying paradigm that says you are in a situation where one's opinion is valuable, even though it is only held to you, but we should still defer to the general conception of an overarching good which the people demand. If you, at a fundamental level, reject any facet of the validity of someone's opinion on an a priori level, if you simply cannot believe that these individuals have anything to offer because it is so heretical and inherently alien that there's no point even listening, then you can't prosper or function in a remotely productive manner because you are inherently rejecting the principles upon which you would use to defend integrating them in the first place. So we would say that it seems clear, with this analysis in mind, that these preachers bring explicit harms in the form of deaths through terrorism, integration through ghettoization, a terrible damage to the impact and image of Muslims within these societies, and can be easily filtered out with a mechanism brought to you by proposition, and it is now opposition's obligation to show us exactly why we as a government have a duty to allow these opinions to be voiced, because we might say there's legislation, but there's no one listening to legislate when they're in a mosque preaching this hate, ladies and gentlemen. It's for these reasons we beg you to vote.
I'd like to thank the whip figure of the proposition for his fine speech, and call upon Charlie to go to place for Sheffield, the opposition, and for finalists. Here, here.
Madam Speaker, this certainly isn't the debate, or sorry, Mr. Speaker, this certainly isn't the debate that I think everyone thought they were going to get. But nonetheless, what is this debate really about, or what is it at least become about? This clearly isn't a debate about whether we should deny terrorists or not, like, entry to the UK, right? This is not even like a kind of mechanism debate about whether we can kind of see whether they're going to be terrorists. This is about what is better for states, the creation of a singular strong national narrative or a pluralistic multicultural discourse in which we question values. And it's also about, can these fundamental values change? And is that something that can we question? Are predominant values something which we should promote, or can we have them questioned? I'm going to talk about two things today, which have become the main issues. Firstly, about does this hurt or help society, and then secondly, does this hurt or help immigration? Let's go into it. So first of all, first proposition stood up here and said these people won't integrate, i.e. people who don't like gays or whatever. First of all, we like to think somewhat perhaps higher of people, that even if people can't necessarily get on together, there won't be riots on the streets when people go out just because they don't hold quite the same values as them. And they gave us no explanation of why society necessarily implodes. But even if it's not, the motion is not about stopping criminals, right? Because we already do that. This is about that conflict between a national narrative. Count to 15, Joe, seriously. The counting of a strong national narrative versus a multicultural pluralistic discourse. We believe the latter is better. Why is that true? Firstly, we think pluralism, as Pete gave you in his speech, is about a questioning of values. The motion presumably is also about other states and not just about British immigration policy. Would it be an example the good or legitimate for Bahrain to exclude Bahrain or Arab states to exclude Christians? We think what happens is a varied discourse critiques ideas and creates a better society as a whole, when ideas can be questioned to find the right outcome. But also, let's look more in depth about what happens on a citizen-to-citizen basis, which is what the debate came about in the second half. We say what this does is defines inherently, if we're talking about Britain, what Britishness is by creating a set of what we think our values are. What does this impact have on the people who are already here, for example? And this is where we get onto the second half about the creation of ghettos. Even if these people do hold values if they like, for the people who are already here, it makes them much less want to engage with the state. When the state has stood up and said, you are not British and you are not like us because we don't hold these values. That means even if we are talking about crazy terrorists, their supporters are probably more likely to support them at the point said you can't engage with the state at all, and we're not even going to try and engage with you. We also think it makes them marginalised. And if we're talking about the concrete harms that accrue to society, which first propositions say, we think that's what divides it. But secondly, we also get onto this idea that these guys just said, well, they won't contribute. Their only real analysis behind that was they can't engage on fundamental levels. They said fundamental quite a lot, by the way. Not sure if that counts as analysis. So firstly, why is that necessarily true? We think, for instance, probably these people want money and might want to work and find a job, for example, if we're talking about economic immigrants rather than asylum seekers. Actually, funnily enough, what we see with asylum seekers is that these people are some of the most productive people in society because they feel as though society has done them a favour. and has owed them something which we think is good. But secondly, as Pete tells you again, we have laws to stop things like racial incitement. And we think even if they do these things, we have a critique of discourse in this society. When people stand up and say offensive things, we say that's wrong. And we think that creates a stronger assertion of these values when you have a critique debate altogether. But even if they are really bad, so even if we are talking about these terrorist imams, funnily enough, one of Ben's main arguments was about the creation of homegrown terrorists and how they feel. We think these are the people who are most dangerous in our society because it's difficult to keep an eye on them. We usually keep track of people who we suspect as coming from training camps in Pakistan, or probably don't let them come altogether. But the point on this, Mr. Speaker, is it's more likely to lead to the creation of homegrown terrorists when they feel as though their cultural values can never be aligned with the state, and now the state has codified that in their immigration policy. Secondly, we get on to, does this help or hurt immigration? Go on then.
Okay, either way, and a message is going to be said that asylum seekers can be bad. Under our model, it's only an abstract government message. Under your model, people actually get to see people and then tarnish other asylum seekers with the same
it's not quite an abstract government message, because on our side we say we take asylum seekers because they're in a shit position. On your side, you say we codify in law which asylum seekers can come into our country because of the views that they hold, regardless of how terrible their position is. So that's the difference in the asylum policy, and we think our side is better, but I'm going to go on to explain more the perpetuation of that now. So first problem, again, as Pete points out, made the case that they don't have a very nuanced view of immigration. This is true. What we think it does is it changes the views that we hold of asylum seekers and the types of impact this has on our immigration policy. We think it says, for example, that asylum isn't absolute and that there can and should be some conditionality in place. What does it do? Pre brings you a couple of things which are really important that are never responded to by closing government. He tells you it makes it vulnerable to rhetoric that we can cut down on asylum because asylum should be some value to the state that occurs. I told you in my first point why we think that asylum has value for the state anywhere, but it makes it vulnerable to that kind of rhetoric that says we can cut down it, we can increase economic migrants more, but has less of asylum seekers. But also, we think when you do this, it undermines issues about freedom of speech and freedom of expression generally that we think asylum is good for. Think about it, Mr. Speaker. The reason why we have asylum seekers is to say we like it that you can get out of your country and have a freedom to express your views, which you previously couldn't do before under your oppressive regimes. We're probably undermining that somewhat when you say, well, you can express your views, just not all of the time when we don't like them and they're not the predominant values that we hold. We think that's incredibly damaging for the type of the perpetuation of values that we want. And if you agree this is a debate about what values, and let's be honest, they set this up very narrowly when they said, well, pretty much just hating the gays is something that we want to do, so thanks for that, guys. But the point is, if we agree we want those values, then we need a black and white system of immigration that supports them as well, particularly for asylum seekers. I told you two things about why this helps society and why this helps why this hurts society, hurts immigration. For both of those reasons, please oppose.